Hello and welcome to today's BeyondTrust presentation. This presentation is about the integration between password safe and the secure remote access tools, such as remote support or privileged remote access, and the integration benefits. Before we get started, I just wanted to clarify a bit of nomenclature. First, password safe, BeyondTrust PAM flagship product, is abbreviated with PWS. SRA stands for Secure Remote Access. It's one of the product pillars. And there's two solutions that fall in that category. First, we have remote support, our service desk or help desk remote access solution. And the second one is PRA or privileged remote access, a solution that was specifically made with vendor and contractor access use cases in mind. And, by the way, without the need for VPN. Quick look at the agenda here for this entire session. We're going to start with looking at some of the integration value aspects. Why is it important? Why is it useful to you? After that, we're going to do a remote support and password safe integration demo, how it looks in action. After that, we're going to do a privileged remote access and password safe integration demo. And at the very end, I'm going to walk you through how the integration is actually set up. All right, let's have a look at some of the integration value aspects that I wanted to highlight. And first, let's have a look at the security benefits. For example, just a basic important value aspect is that if you use both products in conjunction, password safe integrated with remote support, credentials that are used in remote sessions are centrally stored in the password safe vault. That means they're protected through encryption at rest and transit. Authentication is protected with multi-factor and many other different hardening and security aspects. Just that fact allows you to meet many regulations or regulatory compliances and even cyber insurance requirements. With the integration, credentials can be injected at runtime as part of remote sessions. For example, when you have a UAC prompt or if you need to log on to an endpoint. With the integration, we can inject those credentials without exposing a password. That also means that the credentials are protected in the password safe vault. They are protected from accidental or intended misuse, right? The users don't know the passwords anymore. They don't see the passwords anymore. They don't have to copy and paste them anymore. When we vault credentials, ideally, and that's certainly our recommendation, is to frequently rotate credentials, especially the privileged credentials, meaning you want to rotate them based on a schedule, but also every time they were used. And that ultimately allows you to achieve a higher level of security by protecting credentials against pass-the-hash attacks that take advantage of stale passwords and extract them from memory. And ultimately, if you have a PAM solution that you use to store many or all of the different privileged credentials that are in use in your organization, you have a single point for visibility, a single point for audit for all the managed credentials that are used either internally by service desk representatives or even external vendors and contractors that use them to access your systems. I can also think of a couple of usability benefits for the end users, your service desk reps or your external vendors and contractors that are using remote support or PRA. Now, having the integration in place creates actually like a single sign-on experience for users. I mean, think about it. They only need one single credential. That is to their personal account, ideally just a standard account in Active Directory or in Azure AD. And they use that to authenticate to BeyondTrust, to remote support or PRA. After that, as they're accessing the different systems that they're allowed to access, as they have to authenticate with a privileged account, they will be able to inject those credentials directly from the vault without copy and pasting them, without looking them up, and ultimately that saves them time. And it also reduces the responsibility with maintaining and storing those passwords, multiple passwords for different systems. And all of that is possible without VPN. Our remote support, our PRA technologies don't require a VPN for remote connectivity. And the tool can be accessed through a local console that's available for Windows, Mac, or even Linux desktops. But there's also a browser-based console that can be used, makes it very easy to access it from any system, from anywhere. And we also have mobile apps for both applications. So it ultimately increases the productivity because your users can connect more often, they can access the tool easier, and are not bound to certain limitations or requirements. Let's talk about the password-safe and SRA integration, how it works, how it's implemented. The purpose of the integration is obvious. It's there to remove the need to share or expose credentials to your users by automatically injecting them from the password vault within the different secure remote access remote sessions. So that could be a service desk technician having a UAC prompt with an end user system, or a vendor that needs to authenticate to a server to perform maintenance, install updates. And the way we integrate both systems, password safe and remote support, is through a software program that's called the Endpoint Credential Manager, ECM. It essentially interfaces with both products using REST APIs. The requirements for the ECM are fairly conservative. It requires a Windows client or server OS. At the point when I looked it up, it was Windows Vista actually was the minimum system there, but only 64-bit architectures. You can see it requires .NET 4.5 or later, and 2 gigahertz processor, 2 gigabytes of memory, and some disk space, potentially for log files, but 80 gigabytes is more than enough. With the ECM in place, it enables the SRA products to pull credentials from password safe. So a user that is logged on to an SRA product can access the approved credentials in password safe. So when you log on to a Windows client, or you have a UAC prompt as part of a support session, it will suggest the appropriate credentials that are available for the system. So, for example, the local administrator or the service desk's privileged account in Active Directory. And very similar on the vendor side, just obviously from a vendor perspective. So the vault then suggests the credentials, but also takes care of the seamless injection of the credentials in the username and password fields. Ultimately, again, this means that the credentials are stored and owned by password safe. All right, welcome to the demonstration of privileged remote access with password safe. And this is mostly about external parties such as contractors or vendor leveraging PRA to access assets within your environment without the need for a VPN. There's multiple ways how a vendor could access and use the PRA tool, a desktop-based access console that's available for Windows, Mac, and Linux desktops. But there's also a very popular browser-based console. All you need is a somewhat modern browser, such as Edge, Chrome or Firefox, Safari, to access the remote access console. So we provide the URL to our PRA instance, and then the vendor can authenticate with their given username and password. she can securely access some of the assets that she's responsible for using my PRA instance. First thing the vendor sees when they browse to my PRA instance is the login agreement. They have to accept it. And then from here, they'll be able to authenticate. In my case, leveraging AD credentials layered on with TOTP multi-factor authentication. But of course, this is also where you could leverage your existing IAM provider like Okta or Azure AD and leverage SAML. All right, so in this case, I'm just pulling up Martha's Google Authenticator. Once confirmed, we're now in the PRA Access Console. There are mainly two items here for my vendor, jump items and active sessions. So right now we're in the jump items view. And so from here, a vendor can access the connections that I made available to her. I will start with a simple example here. Down here we have a production control server. Host name is WinServer 2019. It's a Windows server, and we're using the remote RDP connection method, which leverages just regular RDP. The vendor initiates the connection here, or what we call a jump. That will then bring up the authentication window. And there's two options in my case. We have the specific user option, old-fashioned, where a vendor could type in a username and password to authenticate, but of course, ultimately, that's something that we want to get away from. Much more secure would be the integration with password safe, and that'll give us the option to present the vendor with the credential store. So the credential store suggests credentials to be used for that connection, for authentication, based on the policy. So these are the credentials that I've made available to Martha. Again, this could look very different in your case, but here we have a pooled account. We have the local administrator account, and we have Martha's privileged account in Active Directory. So the point here is that with the integration, we can now suggest vaulted credentials, password-safe vaulted credentials to the vendor to be used for authentication. So instead of giving out the username and password that they use in privileged scenarios where they have to authenticate to an asset with a different account other than their standard account that they've been given, we can vault them, we can make them available through the integration, and as a result, we can perform the authentication here as part of that remote jump. Right? So now that she is authenticated here, we can see that she's actually logged on with her -ADM account. So this is different than the account that she's logged on with here, her standard account to PRA. This is a vaulted account in password safe. And we now just injected that as part of that PRA remote session. So we have the benefit of sort of like a single sign-on experience for the vendor, right? They don't have to copy and paste or type in other username and passwords or keys. And then, of course, from a security perspective, right, we're protecting these accounts. They're vaulted in password safe. And once the vendor is done with that session here, and once they're in that session, we can immediately rotate that password and make sure that even though we never exposed the password, it's actually being rotated to provide some additional protection against pass-to-hash attacks that would attempt maybe to extract stale credentials from memory. So that was one example here. And also works with shell jumps. So any Unix, Linux-based connections here, we have an asset ELF server 01 that Martha is authorized to connect to. Again, from here, she could initiate the jump. But since this is a shell jump, not an RDP connection, we get some credentials that are related to the system here. And, in my example, we got a privileged account vaulted in password safe for Martha here, mdavis_uadmin, or in my case, the root account, something that we definitely don't want to give out the key or the password for. So instead, again, we vault this account in password safe. We allow the vendor to use that account as part of that session, but we never expose the password. So here, when we confirm this, PRA is now checking out the root password from password safe and now injecting that as part of the authentication process. And you can see we are now logged in as root here to the system. Again, injected from password safe and therefore protecting those credentials. And then based on my configuration here, when the vendor is done with that session, password safe will initiate a credential reset right after that session is being terminated and the password checked into the vault. All right, let's go through the password safe SRA integration setup tasks. First, I wanted to highlight that the integration is very well documented on our documentation portal. Navigate to beyondtrust.com/docs, go to privileged remote access or remote support, and then under how to, you can find the different steps that are required for the integration. Well, let's level set here, just looking at a couple slides before we get into some more details. The core of the integration is the endpoint credential manager. Ultimately, that's there to remove the need to share or expose credentials to your SRA users, your vendors, contractors, by retrieving credentials from the password safe vault and then injecting them as part of the remote sessions. The ECM actually interfaces between both products, password safe and SRA, using the REST API interfaces on both sides. The ECM can be installed externally, and it just requires a Windows system. Doesn't have to be a server, as can be a client, 64-bit, and you see some of the requirements below. Ultimately, the SRA integration then pulls the credentials from password safe at runtime so that the logged on SRA users can then access those credentials. You'd be presented with a list of credentials that one has access and approval to use, and then we can inject them as part of remote connections in the SRA products. And the benefit here again is that password safe owns those credentials, right? They're centrally stored. No matter who is going to engage in proxy or remote sessions, the credentials are always stored in password safe. That's where they're checked out. That's where they're checked back in, and where we can ensure that they're being rotated after use or based on a schedule. And now we have a central repository for all of the auditing and logging and reporting. This session here actually is using the built-in integration of the ECM, the endpoint credential manager. So this here is a screenshot of Beyond Insight configuration. This is also the home of password safe, and there is a quote-unquote new configuration item called secure mode access, and then connect to secure mode access. This is where you configure your integration with your SRA product. So essentially telling password safe, hey, this is your SRA backend that will be allowed to communicate with the API in order to check out credentials as part of remote sessions. So we have a URL connector here, port, find an API key, but that's pretty much it. It simplifies the integration between those products quite significantly. Now, the first most important aspect for the integration to work is to allow the credentials to be accessed via the API. So let's have a look at password safe. I'm already logged in here. I'm at the managed account sections and looking at one of the accounts that can be used in PRA or remote support sessions for injection, mdavis-adm. Any account that you want to make available on the SRA side for authentication for credential injection has to be accessible via the API. So here under account settings, the slider API enabled has to be turned on. This is a very basic, most important requirement for the integration to work. Number 2, the user has to exist on both sides. So we have a vendor user. That user has to be set up on both sides, in password safe and on the SRA side. These accounts have to match. If I have a user mdavis, that user account has to exist in password safe and on the SRA side. They have to match for the integration to work. The next important part is for the integration to having the right access on the SRA side. So in my case here, I'm logged onto my PRA interface, and in here under management, we have the API configuration. And you can see here that I have an API account, so to speak, called ECM integration, right? This is what the password safe integration will use. This is where we get the auth client ID and the client secret that we, again, use as part of the password safe configuration. All right. In password safe itself, it is pretty straightforward now. Again, simplifying the setup using the built-in configuration. We hop over here to the configuration, go down to secure mode access. We have connect to secure mode access. And again, this is where I would enter the values that we just created from the API connector on the SRA side. Now, the one thing that is helpful to troubleshoot the integration is, of course, our log files. So if you're running a virtual appliance, the UVM to host password safe, then you would log on to the appliance and you access the log file folder. Just gonna get ready to get into my UVM here to show what I'm talking about. And there's a folder on the C drive under program files that we can access to examine any possible issues here with the integration. So it all comes back to the locally installed ECM, and here on the program files, we go to the BombGuard subfolder, we have the ECM folder, and then within here we have 2 log files, but mostly for operational troubleshooting, the ECM.log is the log that you want to look at if anything is not working correctly, if users get an error message or credentials aren't showing up. This is the log file you want to look at. So let's have a look at how it actually looks like when we're actually performing tasks with the integration enabled. Let me log in here as a vendor user. Of course, we're protecting that with multi-factor authentication. So after Martha here authenticates with her given username and password, she has to enter the MFA key. And once we're logged in, we then have access to the connections, to the assets that we're entitled to. So here, if we pick one connection here and initiate a jump, now the next step would be the authentication process. And this is where the password safe integration comes into play. Right? With the integration, Martha here can select her personal privileged account, in this case an Active Directory. And once we confirm, now SRA performs the authentication in the background. It checks out the correct password for this account from password safe and authenticates us to this Windows system now. We're now logged in as mdavis-80. In this last chapter, we're gonna examine the good old-fashioned setup between password safe and SRA so that we can utilize the integration between those two products. And this involves two pieces, well, one piece that connects two pieces. So we have the ECM here that needs to be installed on a Windows system. And the ECM, or Endpoint Credential Manager, talks to both password safe and your secure remote access solution. And yeah, here you have some of the detailed screenshots of the ECM configurator and the testing tool. With this type of integration, the ECM runs externally, has to be manually installed on a Windows system. Again, earlier in the other session, we looked at the latest integration method, which runs and pre-configures the ECM directly on the password safe platform Beyond Insight, and it's running either on a UVM or on password safe cloud as part of the cloud tenant. Again, password safe and the SRA integration, ECM connects those two ends so that ultimately we don't have to give out credentials anymore. Passwords in clear text, they can now be retrieved at runtime from the password safe vault and injected as part of the SRA remote sessions. The ECM interfaces with both products, password safe and SRA, using REST APIs. The requirements for the ECM are fairly conservative. It has to be a Windows OS, but it can be a Windows client, and it can also be a server OS. 64-bit architecture is required, .NET 4.5 or later, a little bit of CPU and memory and disk space. I don't think you need that much, but to accommodate log file growth, probably want to account for some disk space just for the ECM. Ultimately, the SRA product, remote support or PRA, pulls the credentials from the password safe vault as needed, so that logged on users can access those credentials and use them as part of remote connections. For the most part, the SRA vault, side of the vault, will suggest the appropriate credentials for a connection. So you're connecting to a Windows endpoint, it'll suggest the appropriate Windows related credentials that you have access to in for Unix, Linux, the Unix, Linux credentials. The benefit here again is that password safe owns the credentials. They're centrally stored, so you have a central repository to manage and control credentials, to ensure they're rotated aggressively, and you also then have a central point for reporting and auditing, logging. Ultimately, it just makes for a more effective management security posture for privileged credentials. The integration is very well documented. If you head over to BeyondTrust/docs and then either go to remote support or privileged remote access under how to, you'll find the password safe integration right here, the different steps that are required to perform the integration configuration. Let's start with the most important aspect for an integration to work, and that is to expose the credentials, the vaulted credentials in question via the API. So we'll head over to password safe here. I'm already in the managed accounts view, and one of the credentials that I use as part of my demonstration here is Martha's M. Davis's privileged credentials in Active Directory, mdavis-adm. So, this using as an example, when we look at the account settings, one important option that has to be turned on here for the integration to work is exposing a credential via API. So here under account settings, there's a switch API enabled that has to be turned on. You don't have to do this on every single account manually. This can be controlled in bulk using smart roles. But just so you know, any account that you want to see, make available as part of the integration, this has to be turned on for the account in question. All right. Now, the second important aspect is that the users, the operating SRA, the users, the vendor, contractor users, their user accounts, their standard accounts that they're using to authenticate to the SRA product, they have to exist on both sides, on the password safe side and on the SRA side. That's what I mean by that is, since we're here in password safe, we go to user management here. Using my example user, M. Davis, she is actually a member of this group called requesters. So here under users, you can see we have M. Davis, right? And if we head over to the SRA management portion here, to log back in, you'll see that the user exists there too. So once this is loading here, we can log in here as an administrator again. All right, almost there. And then when we head over here to users and security, and then users actually, and we can look at in my case, the Active Directory users, we have M. Davis, right? So you can see that this user here that I'm using exists on both sides, and it has to match between password safe and SRA. So that means when we log on to the SRA product to check out sessions, right, then there has to be a match between the user object here on the SRA side and on the other side, on the password safe side, so that when we access credentials that there is a match. All right. So number one, we have to expose accounts via API. Number two, user objects have to exist on both sides. Number three, for the ECM to work, is an API registration. So the ECM has to have permissions on both sides, on password safe and the SRA side to function, right? If we go back to the slide that we had earlier, just in here you can see the ECM sits in between. So it has to connect and authenticate on both ends. So we'll start with the password safe side. We go over here to the configuration, and then here under API registration, we need an API registration for the ECM to use. So we have to set this up, and that creates a API key that'll be used. We don't need any of these options. We need IP rules to ensure that the ECM can talk to password safe. But that is one requirement here. All right, that was number three. Number four, we need to assign a user that is used by the ECM to leverage the API to talk to password safe. So if you go back to configuration here, what I've done is under user management, I created a user group that's called API accounts. And then when we look at the group, you can see that there's a API user, API 1, that's the one I'm using. And here's the critical part. That user group has to be associated with that API registration on the password safe side. All right. So that was number four. Next, we need the actual ECM installer. I'm sorry, actually, before we go there, of course, we also need a number five, which is the on the other side, on the SRA side, we need an API account. So very similar to the API registration on the password safe side. If you go here to the SRA console, again, it's the same between remote support and PRA. Under API configuration, we need an API account, ECM integration. When we set this up, this gives us then the auth client ID and the client secret, and you can see there's a specific permission set that is required for the ECM. All right. So those are the requirements that need to be in place and configured correctly. And next we have to look at retrieving the ECM installer from BeyondTrust. And you can get this from the customer portal. When you log on to the BeyondTrust customer portal, head over to File Downloads, and then we'll bring this up here, the full list again. If you go to File Downloads, search for product, there's the first off the ECM here, the Endpoint Credential Manager. So you need that. And then also, in addition to the install itself, you need the ECM plugin. So if you go down to, password safe, it's on top here. I scrolled through it a couple times now. Yep, the password safe ECM plugin, that is required as well. So those are the two files. And you want to copy those to your server host, run the installer, and load the plugin. And once that is completed here on your Windows host and installed, this is the installation folder under Program Files here. You can launch the ECM configurator. And what you got to do here is you have to put in the client ID and client secret that you get from your SRA API configuration. Obviously, the correct URL. Port is always 443. And then for log level, you can define that here as well. And yeah, once that's configured, you can actually examine a log file here. There in the installation folder, there is a log file specifically for the configurator that you can examine, the ECM or the configurator.log. And then next, you need to configure the password safe connection. So under endpoint URL, this is where you put in the URL IP hostname to your password safe appliance. So here, this is my hostname. This part here at the end is always the same, at least as of right now, as of today. So then you get the API registration key. So again, this is the API key that we get from password safe, and we created the API registration. The user, right, that we created as part of our API group, and the user object username here, that's what we need. And then once you have those two pieces, you can also run a test to make sure that the integration is working. And the way the test works is you essentially authenticate to the test tool here the same way you would authenticate to password safe, right? And this one here, again, has to match that this user object that we're using for testing has to exist on both sides, password safe and the SRA side. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use an AD user, M Davis, right? That's our standard account. And then I'm going to check and see if we can access the API shared credentials that are associated with a host. In my case, I'm going to specify this one here. And then when we run a test, it should show us the credentials that we could check out as part of the integration. So once this runs, right, so these are the 3 credentials that are associated, available with this asset object. So this is a good sign. It tells me that the ECM can communicate successfully with password safe. So once this is in place, then we should be able to just use the integration as configured. So if we go back into the SRA, in this case PRA console, we can check out a session here again for Windsor 2019. You can see I'm still logged in as M Davis, right? So we should have technically see 3 credentials that are suggested from password safe. So if we initiate our jump here, there you go. The ECM now pulled back those 3 credentials that are available to M Davis to be used on this host. And from here, we can now select those credentials that we want to use, click OK. And now finally, SRA establishes that connection here via jump point, performs the authentication in the background, and then authenticates us to this asset as mdavis-adm. All right, this is the end of this entire presentation. Hopefully this was helpful. Thank you very much.